Shortly after the publication of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there were a couple of polls conducted nationally. And the very first poll conducted said that in spite of the characterization genocide, that 7 out of 10 Canadians wanted to reconcile. 2 or 3 years later, another report came and said more than 8 out of 10, 84% of Canadians still wanted to reconcile. And so somewhere out there in our country, there's a real desire by so many people to want to reconcile.
I'm Michael Tamblyn, CEO of Rakuten Kobo. This is Kobo in Conversation. My guest today is Chief Robert Joseph, a hereditary chief of the Gwawaenuk First Nation, honourary witness of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and he's joining us on this show because he's the author of a new book, Namwayut, A Path to Reconciliation. In this book, Chief Joseph shares an intimate view of his own life and experiences while making an impassioned plea to readers to embrace vulnerability, summon the courage to recognize truth and trauma, and take steps towards reconciliation. Chief Joseph, welcome to Kobo.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really wonderful introduction. Thank you for that.
You served as an honorary witness to Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You're the ambassador for Reconciliation Canada and an officer of the Order of Canada. And so based on that, one might think that you've done a lot and it's time to put your feet up. But you also wrote this book, Namwayut. Why write a book now?
It was so important to write the book. We're on the threshold of probably the greatest social change about to happen in Canada. And we need to more than ever get to know each other, all Canadians and Indigenous people. We have to acknowledge the state of our union, that it hasn't been good, that there's been too deep a divide and division between Indigenous people and the newcomers to this country. So it's important always to begin from the beginning, to tell our stories to each other so that we truly understand how we got into this mess that we're in at the moment, and how we begin to visualize pathways to reconciliation together. And we need absolutely everybody in the country, every color, every race, every creed, to engage in this process called reconciliation, because that's who we are. We represent just about all of the diversity and difference among humankind. And so it's no different in Canada. We need to, with all the ethnic groups and other groups, get together now and have a dialogue, a discussion where a meaningful discussion takes place, because it won't, transformation won't happen unless we have this discussion. And so the book is timely in regard to pointing out some of that ancient history from one person's perspective, mine, but that it represented and reflected the experiences of so many people across the country. And on the other side of the equation, ever since the first newcomer came, the separation, division, racism, and hatred has existed, and we won't get past that unless we talk to each other, look each other in the eye and say, oh my God, I'm sorry, I forgot we were all human beings.
And can you explain specifically what Namwayut means, what the meaning of that term?
Yeah, Namwayut is found in the Kwakwala language of the Gwawaenuk Nation on the Pacific Northwest coast. It's an ancient language, and this one word is so paramount, Namwayut. It means we are all one. And Namwayut was said in salutation every day for everyday common meetings between people, but it had a deeper context as well. We also knew that we were one with the universe, one with creation, one with the animal world, one with the birds that fly and those things that swim. And when we had encounters with those elements, any part of those elements, we would acknowledge that we were Namwayut, whether we were thanking them for the bounty from which we got sustenance, or whether we were encountering a grizzly bear, and we said, "Please, please keep me safe, Namwayut." So so imagine if we thought of the world around us in that context, just the level of sanctity would be so high that we have respect and admiration and acceptance of everything and everyone in our universe.
And so, not just a philosophical term, but something that you would say to each other, as a greeting.
Upon meeting each other on the road or wherever, we would say, Tela Kasla Namwayut. Greetings, you who are one with me. And so it was an everyday common salutation at the same time as it summons a higher consciousness about our the presence and well-being. And I think that we chose Namwayut as a core value for Reconciliation Canada because that's what we're really doing. And here's the thing, we're actually calling all of ourselves, Canadians all, to live out our highest consciousness, to be our best selves, to always care for others, that we have a responsibility to each other. And so Namwayut has all of that connotation, and it's so simple and straightforward and such common usage that we build that spirit through one word of interconnectedness between us, that we all share the same space and that we all need to, as I said, take care of each other.
A major theme of the book is that the need to look straight on at hurt, to hear testimony and to take in the details of harm that's taken place, especially through the relationship between settlers and Indigenous people, residential school system. How do you hope to change? What do you hope to change by having people hear that message?
One of the things I've learned while working on reconciliation is that one absolute need is to have dialogue between us. Begin to look each other in the eye, sit around kitchen tables, sit around town halls, or wherever we meet Canadians and Indigenous people. And included in the Canadians, of course, is this extension of all of the diversity we have in Canada. Mm-hmm. So the focus deepens a little bit when we talk about our oneness between Canadians and we Indigenous people. But between Canadians and themselves, everybody on earth is here. So we need to begin to recognize that as well, because racism and hatred has no walls. And we have to begin to tear down those walls. And the only way will be when we have deep dialogue with meaning that actually transforms our consciousness.
Just to get a sense of how this story is rooted, can you tell me a little bit about your life and the community you grew up in before you went to residential school?
Yes, I just before I went to residential school, I was just 6 years old, I think. I lived in a beautiful little place called Gwawaenuk. It's called Guilford Island today. It's a colonial name for it. But it was on a midden, thousands of years old, with clamshells going down as deep as you could dig. And it indicated just how long we must have been there through all of that millennia, growing, our families, little children growing up. And there was still the worldview of Indigenous people was still intact. And it's an all-inclusive worldview. And I imagine other worldviews feel the same way, but inclusive of our connection to the land, where our very genesis were spoken of, emanating from the land through magical, supernatural transformation. And at that time, every person who grew up in Gwawaenuk could relate to that genesis, to that moment, to that energy that became our first ancestor. And so we had this deep connection, not only to the territory, but to the families who believed in the same things, who spoke the same language, but who were so close-knit in our communities. It was one of the best places for a child to grow up. There was so much love. I remember as a little boy growing up, and I kept hearing things like wadzid, my granny or my aunties or other relatives in the community would say, "Tela kesla wadzid, greetings, my monumental one," or "Glugwe, hello, supernatural gift to us, supernatural gift, Glugwe." And there was these magical words, one word at a time sometimes, that gave such a sense of value and belonging and connectedness. And it was really, really a happy time, and such a contrast when we all started ending up in those residential schools. We're struggling really hard to regain some of the elements of worldview that we held in the old days around culture and dance and song, about spiritual realities for us. And so we're reviving our language, reviving our dance and song, like I said, and reclaiming some of the past upon which our civilization grew up upon. And I think that's really important. There has to be a continuity. And one of the things about Canada is that it's a young country, and the people who came are newcomers. They don't have that millennial life experience from which knowledge grows. And they're starting from scratch, 150 years in British Columbia, for instance, and it's just not the same. And so, for all of the morality and the moral framework in which we work doesn't apply to newcomers unless they're sort of in some religious experience and are trying to create something with the longevity that we have around our history. Like, history is so important, and that's why in reconciliation we all have to return to history, yours and mine, and we talk about it, but in a mutual sense. We're not going to really reconcile if I'm the only guy telling you my history. You're going to have to tell me your history so I can have a deeper understanding about who you are. And it's important for us, therefore, to have dialogue. That's how we transform our country, I think.
Your book also talks about some of the traditions that were outlawed in communities to kind of break down the social structures of Indigenous communities. Can you talk a bit about what the potlatch meant in your community and why that was so important?
Yeah, it was huge. The potlatch was so, actually, it underlined everything about us, and you could even get that sense even as a young boy or young man growing up. You recognize that the potlatch actually, if understood by others who condemned it, would have known that the potlatch contained the existence of our spiritual beliefs to a creator and that all of our moral obligations to behave in good ways flowed from the teachings, even in the potlatch. And it is where we practice Nawalak, means supernatural, ceremonies. So we danced to acknowledge all of the elements of creation, like I mentioned earlier, the humankind, the undersea kingdom, the forest kingdom, animal kingdom, the spirit world. And the potlatch gave expression to all of those. So it was the basis upon which we were allowed to experience the values of the adults. I'm speaking as a child now, and begin to slowly understand the importance of all of the laws within the context of the potlatch. The potlatch was in every way the central constitution for the Kwakwaka'wakw people, and I'm sure other indigenous groups as well, but just speaking for myself. And so as we grew up, we marked every occasion in life. For children, you validated them through ceremonies, through giving them names throughout the course of their lives, and making them know exactly where they belong by these ceremonies and by the names given or the dances or songs that were placed upon us. And we truly understood our reason for existing. In a long way, we learned that from early childhood to teenage years to young manhood. We knew what our purpose was for living within the context of this, not only a physical constitution, but a spiritual constitution. So it wasn't separate like the state is with the church in modern times. It was all encompassing. It was Namwayut with it. Everything was Namwayut with each other, one with each other. Our laws, and we had policies. They weren't written, but they were all interrelated, interconnected. And the idea was that if you had all of this energy and a mass of knowledge and practice, that it always had to be balanced, in harmony, and peaceful, to bring about the best in all of our citizenship. So potlatch has a very deep meaning beyond the drama and the color and the ritual and the mystery, because there's a lot of mystery in dances sometimes.
And so banning it for 75 years must have been a very effective way to take out a piece of social and economic and cultural infrastructure that tied the community together.
Oh my gosh, you just hit it there. Absolutely. And the authorities, the government, came so close to achieving that goal. And that's why, in part, we hear people beginning to talk about genocide, because all of those government initiatives were intended to destroy our belief systems, our political systems, our economic systems. Every system we had, they intended to completely erase that and make us in their image. That there was only one law, and that was the newcomer law. And they simply wanted to erase all of our ancient knowledge and laws that evolved through the course of millennia. And it was a really dark time for Indigenous people during that particular period. They resisted, however, they didn't lie down and give up. There were ceremonies, potlatches conducted in secret, in hidden places so that authorities couldn't see them. And they did that long enough so that by the time the statute on the potlatch ban was simply removed, there was no announcement of its removal. It just was removed in 1955, I think. we still had a base from which to redevelop this idea of culture being super important. And I really have to say that I'm really pleased at the pace of recovery in our area. Young people everywhere in our villages and communities are delving right into the idea of reclaiming language. And there are various different language groups going on, everybody working hard. And I've never seen until this time just how deep they're delving into it.
Mm-hmm.
And my faith is growing little by little by little that we're going to be able to save Kwakwala as the language. And of course, with the practice of ritual and ceremony, anytime you have a potlatch in our communities now, there isn't enough space to accommodate all the
That's always a
now.
good sign.
Yeah, young people, and they're so interested and they're so committed to learning more about what it means to them. And so this generational transfer of knowledge and skill and everything else is happening. And we are truly going to, first of all, reconcile within our own ranks as Indigenous people, but we're going to reconcile as well with all Canadians and bring forward some of the magic and mystery and power and impact and influence of Indigenous culture that will benefit all Canadians. One of the things I deeply believe in is that we can't reconcile on our own. If we're going to reconcile, it's going to be because Canadians included want to reconcile and are going to engage. And we're going to marry together all of the wisdom and the science between the groups to make our country even better. And we're going to establish new heights of humanity for us, love, compassion, caring for each other. And that's just going to take time and a lot of hard work. But every step we take, starting now, is going to be critically important to creating that massive reconciliation that's going to engulf the country one day. That doesn't mean we're going to ring a bell and say reconciliation is completed.
Mm-hmm.
We never can do that because every generation has to sustain the momentum. Not we anymore in this time, but the next generation has to carry on and meet the failings and shortcomings of humanity, our humanity. And so it's going to be exciting though, because we're going to be better than we've ever been, and our children are going to be better than what we have been, and that's sort of a nice way to think about it.
And I sense as we're talking, we're doing this swing back and forth between the past and the past and the future, that we're kind of moving between the things that have happened that brought us here, and then your hope for what can happen next. So I'm gonna swing us into the past a bit again for a second. Mm-hmm. At 6 years old, you were taken away from this community, and for those who have experienced residential school, or who have parents or grandparents or friends who have experienced it, they know those experiences, or they've heard stories about them. People that don't know that experience, or who haven't read the reports of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, may not understand why it was so harmful, or what was so harmful about it. And it's a huge topic to get into, but it would be so helpful if you could give just a sense or a snapshot of what life was like there for you as a 6-year-old, as you walked through those doors for the first time.
Yeah, I remember the very last time that I left Guilford Island, and I was with my sister. She's deceased now, and our foster mother. And so we had to take this boat ride from this beautiful Eden, this paradise that I have an image of in my mind. And we traveled to Alert Bay by boat, and it was such a beautiful day. The waves were rolling, the sun was shining brightly, the wind was whispering all around us, but not ferociously. And it happened at that day that it seemed to me that we were serenaded by all of the elements that we were truly used to in our territories before the whale hunters came, even. And we saw whales and dolphins serenading and saluting us, eagles soaring overhead, and otters on the beaches, awkward seagulls, ravens prancing in dignity. And I remember the images of that natural world before I finally stepped foot into sort of a current day image of the world. And we got to Alert Bay, and I there were 10 or 12 steps to the first floor of the building. And I remember I was staring up when we got there, and I saw this man on the top of the stairs. He had a black suit or outfit on and a white collar. And I couldn't remember when I'd seen a white person before. So I wondered who and what this man was and what we were doing there. And I was getting a little scared. But anyway, we got up to the landing and then went into the building itself. And the man was talking to my mother. And I knew my mother didn't understand because she just had her head down like this. And then finally, he handed my hand over to this man in black. And we took a left turn in a long hallway, went down a flight of steps, and ended up in the basement. And right at the corner of that room, there were a number of little boys standing naked. One was in a chair with somebody brushing a bowl cut over his head, and he was sent in, and the others were sent in. They had taken my clothes, and I was standing there buck naked. And finally, my turn came, and I got the haircut, and they ushered me into this huge common shower room. I don't know if there were 6 or 8 shower stalls, and every little guy was standing there trying to cover up their private parts and being embarrassed and humiliated. And then they pushed us all into the under the showers, and we were cramped and bumping into each other and feeling embarrassed about that and ashamed about that. Then they started to poke and prod us in humiliating ways. And then we're ordered out of the shower. And then they painted our bodies in some white liquid. And then they doused our head in kerosene. And those were the very first images or things I remember about so long ago. And we had been treated so lovingly in our own ways, in our own places. And to suddenly find ourselves in this huge, strange, huge building was pretty scary. And we weren't allowed to speak Kwakwala. So there were people in the school who spoke Kwakwala. There were 7 languages in that school, by the way, from all the coastal First Nations. And none of us were ever allowed to speak our languages, although we did when we were away from earshot from supervisors. Like in games, for instance, we would have teams playing baseball or soccer, and we'd all end up, our teams would represent the nation languages that we were a part of. So it was fun to know that we could use our language a little bit in those times. But and those languages were spoken by representatives from all 7 nations. But when I left years later, there wasn't, I never heard a Kwakwala language ever spoken. Further to that, in the evening, when it was bedtime, they ushered us into our dorms. There was for the older boys, the senior boys, middle school, and lower school. So we were the lower school, the little kids, and that's how we were divided by dormitory. So when I ended up with those other little guys who were my age, it was scary. We were all ordered to stand beside our beds, given pajamas, and then ordered to kneel down beside the bed and asked to recite as best we could, because there weren't too many people speaking English yet. Recite the prayer that the supervisor was asking us to speak to. But when he left the room, turned out the lights and locked the door, I could hear in the darkness all these little sniffles, all these little kids, so lonely, so afraid. They had to be, because that's how I was feeling. And so I was crying, and I couldn't cry anymore. My tears dried out. Finally, I started to daydream about being home, daydreaming at night, mind you, but dreaming about home. And eventually fell asleep. But the very first morning, there was a bell ringing so loud. I didn't know I'd hear that hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times through the years, 3 or 4 times a day, this bell awakening us. And I heard it, and then I heard the supervisor screaming and shouting and hollering and banging in the door and coming in and hollering things like, "Get up, you dirty little Indian, get up, it's time to get up." And he'd be running from bed to bed, stripping some bedding. Where the kids were really slow to respond, he'd tip over them, flip over the beds. And when everybody was up, he said to all of us, "And now I want to talk to the bedwetters." And we had quite a few bedwetters. And I think tension brings that about, I guess. So there were 6 or 7 little boys who raised their hands. And he said, "You see these stupid little Indians? They wet their beds. They should be ashamed of themselves. Here's what I want the rest of you to do. Form 2 lines at the doorway. And these bedwetters, these dumb Indians, are going to walk through the gauntlet, and you're going to slap them. Wherever you want to slap them, you hit them. And that's the only way they're going to get their laundry, their beddings to the laundry." And so we did that. And then the next, it's all in one day, this thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then we're ushered into the dining room. And I've not been in a dining room before, but it's huge, it's cavernous, it's a basement. And on one side were all the boys, including myself. On the other half were all the girls. We were segregated all through that time. And I was amazed. And we're all looking like this. And suddenly the supervisors hollered and said, "If you look that way, you're going to be punished. You're not ever to wave or try to talk to any of those girls. So you mind your own business." Anyway, we sat down after the prayer. I must have said thousands of times as well over time. It was said, and they started serving the food. And we all had these metal long tables, chairs on each side. And they had picked a table captain to dish out the food. So finally, I had my porridge in front of me. And I looked in there, and there were things moving around in there. It's the first time I've seen worms in the porridge, blackheads. And I looked at the boy next door. All of the porridge was like that. And so I thought, well, I can't eat this. So I watched the guy to the right. I saw him shift all the worms to the side of the bowl, and he ate from the middle. So I thought, well, the best thing I can do while I'm here is just try to follow what others are doing that keeps them safe and keeps them from being cuffed on the head or strapped by ruler or pointer or whatever. So those were sort of the experiences that happened over a long period of time.
Mm-hmm.
And as I thought back on my early time in that school, I figured that even for the first 2 weeks or so, probably all of damage had been done already. That whatever trauma I had, I didn't know anything about trauma, but whatever the damage was, it was completed in the first 2 weeks. And then it was just piled upon over time as we entered the classrooms that day as well.
Mm-hmm.
I've never met a teacher so cruel as this grade 1 teacher. For every infraction, every conceivable infraction she could make herself, we were forced to stand up in corners, beat by leather strap or pointer, like I said. And my schooling, for most, for the most part, in those early years, was not really an education in learning, but an education in preparing for trauma, preparing for the slap, the hit, or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no real concentration on or interest in learning anything other than to try and not be harmed. And that happened. That was such a typical day.
And you describe how that was that was just kind of a compounding from there on for years afterwards. How would you describe the person who came out of that experience?
Well, yeah. So after all of that experience of being afraid all the time, of being traumatized, that's really what happens. You become traumatized,
Mm-hmm.
and your body's only natural reaction and response is immediately to trying to survive that or avoiding it. So we lived in constant fear. And I know years later, when I began to start working with survivors around healing, just before Truth and Reconciliation came around, it wasn't, and we sat around in circles all across the country. There were 1,500 funded residential school healing circles. And we skated around all of our experience until one day I heard this word trauma. And we began to have people who understood it, who were trained in it. And I realized suddenly there was a reason for my breakdown, my fear, my failing, that I wasn't just a bad person like the supervisors always said every day, one way or another, that it was this trauma. And as soon as we were able to identify that, we began to recognize that we could, because we now knew what it was, attempt to deal with that trauma, to find ways to heal and to move away from the core responses that trauma gives to everybody. And when I left school, I was just so angry. I really wanted peace because I've always been that way. Always. I just know that. And yet I was angry, and you can't find peace if you're living in anger, or if you're living with a long history of despair and brokenness. Peace is hard to find, and you can't find healing until you understand all of that and you put it together and you start to slowly find steps towards healing. And eventually it leads to reconciliation, and it eventually leads to the idea that all of us, every human being, whether we're in close contact or we're just neighbors, or maybe my boss or somebody, we're all in this together. We're human. We're part of humanity, and it starts slowly to slide back to ancient indigenous worldview about interconnectedness, like it's in the view that we're all one, that we all belong, and that we're part of the universe. The only way I eventually moved to healing and reconciliation was by divine intervention. I had a have a vision, an epiphany that actually shook me to the core and allowed me to begin to see clearly.
And this was when your friend took you fishing, and it was
Yes.
like a turning point, an awakening.
Yes.
Can you describe that experience a little bit?
You know, I worked really hard, even with all of the trauma that I carried and the despair and the unbelieving of my own self. I worked really hard to try to be something. But if you do these things and they're things of valor or success, but deep inside you, you have this voice saying, no, you're not good enough to do that or be that or anything for that matter. It's a really difficult role to follow. So one day I was in Canberra River. I had a really good job. I had a big house, I had a couple of cars and a garage, you know, those kind of things. And I was working in the civil service. And but and I had lots of good jobs before that. But every time I was haunted by my memories of those experiences in St. Michael's Residential School, I would drink. And I would drink for a day, two, three, and it just grew. And so that when that happened, even in my good job, I began to feel embarrassed and ashamed. And so I didn't want to work there anymore because I developed good friends who were believing in me, thinking I was worthy and a good human being, good colleague. And I'd move on, find another job. So my last job was in Canberra River, and it was really a public job. I was a district manager for Indian and Northern Affairs Canada. I had a big staff, and all of the communities north of Canberra River, Indigenous, were our clients, and we did well. But one day I found my wife and my children had left. I have 5 children, and they had been getting tired of this pattern and the harm that comes with that pattern, the effect it has on them. So, of course, I did what I'd always done. I started to drink really lots. And pretty soon I wasn't working, and soon the power in my house was cut off. I read, so every day, as soon as I woke up, I would head to the bar and do the same thing, and then somehow end up back home at whatever time it was. And I would get to the house and try to listen. The bedroom in my house was, the master bedroom was in the front where the roadway comes to the house, and I would listen to see if I could hear my wife walking up the pathway, or I'd listen to see if I could hear my children's pitter patter, their feet pitter pattering in the house, and then I fall into deep sleep until I woke up again like this. One day I ran into this friend of mine. I used to fish with him. And he said to me, Bobby Joe, wait up. I want to talk to you. So I didn't want to wait up. I didn't want to talk to him. But nonetheless, he insisted. So he said, I don't like what you've done to yourself, what you're doing to yourself. You should get out of town for a day or two, even just to get out of town and break from this a little. I said, okay. I knew I was in trouble, so I didn't argue with him. He said, you know where the boat is tied up? Just go down there now, and we're going to leave early in the morning. So I don't know how I got to that boat, but I woke up in the morning and opened my eyes. And for a millisecond, I was okay. And then I remembered who I was, what I'd become. I could smell the booze oozing out of my pores, and the despair and the darkness swept over me. I looked around, and everybody else on the boat was asleep. So I was so full of shame and so embarrassed. I didn't want to see them then until I snuck out of the bunk, went through the engine room up to the galley, to the back of the boat, and discovered we were anchored out in a place called Greensea Bay in Johnson Strait, Vancouver Island on the other side. And as I got to the deck, I was crying. I was so desperate. And I walked around a drum. There's a huge drum at the stern of the boat. And I threw myself behind a drum, thinking, I'm going to hide behind this drum. I just really didn't want to be seen anymore. Mm-hmm. But as I had walked toward the drum, I saw that Johnson Straits, that's the name of the body of water. It was so powerful. It was coral, green, blue. It had lightning rods streaming through it, so much energy. And I saw the forest really dense, green, powerful. And I saw the lightning bolts going through that. And soon I was staring into the heavens, and I saw the whole universe. They're sort of images I've seen on television, sometimes in real, but they came back as images in my mind. And as I stared upward, I heard this voice say to me, in spite of what you've done to yourself, I love you, and you belong to all of this. And then I came back to the moment, crept back into my bunk. We went fishing that day, and then late that evening we headed back to Campbell River, and I did what I'd always done when I'm scared and running and don't have any capacity to think anyway. I borrowed money from the crew members and went back to the darkest corner of a bar in Campbell River. But it was different this time. I drank and drank, and somewhere near closing time, I realized that I just wasn't getting high. Mm-hmm. I put myself away from the table and I walked home. My home was walking distance from downtown. And I lay down and I had the best sleep ever in my life. And I woke up the next morning. I just knew I couldn't go back to that lifestyle. I couldn't drink anymore, and that I needed help and I wanted to change. And ever since that time, I've been on this road, promoting healing for others and myself, encouraging reconciliation for all of us. And I think that had it not been for that divine intervention, I probably would have been doing the same thing. I just didn't have the capacity. I don't know if I would have had the capacity to turn direction as I've done in all these 20 years. But the story behind that vision is that my worst fears was that I was all alone and nobody cared and nobody loved me and I was worthless and had no purpose. And that vision changed everything. So in all the work I've been doing in the last 2.5 decades, I've been guided by that experience. And then I had a couple of visions in the course of my lifetime, that have guided my experience. Yeah.
There's a subtle point that you make in the book that I was hoping you could expand on a bit here. You say that your work on reconciliation has shown you that there are two kinds of people: those who have suffered and in whom we can recognize our own trials and traumas, and those who are ready to listen and make things right. And it's such an interesting distinction, because it means that anyone who's resistant to reconciliation, and unfortunately, we do hear from those who would just want to put all this in the past and have everybody get over it. They're also kind of the first type, they're also part of the hurt and suffering type too. And I'm interested in your thoughts around those two kinds of people.
Yeah, we with respect to the indigenous people, it's so difficult to be part of a race of people that's been colonized by every measure. The things that the colonizers do, intentionally or not, subjugates indigenous people, removes them from their natural reality from Genesis times, and everything, their principles and values, their belief systems, and their practices, just everything about the colonized people is dismissed. And the newcomers impose everything that we don't understand, everything that we don't know about. And it's such a major rift, a departure between us. And it only gets worse when the boots are on the ground, when the people started coming from overseas and began to migrate to our territories. They were these impacts were not only from government edict anymore, but they flowed from the senses of the newcomers through prejudice, wrongful assumption, hatred, racism. And that's where the real damage begins to happen. And that's why I think Indigenous people and all other Canadians really need to understand this separation division. And we're not going to do that through the normal course of programs that exist. We're going to do that because we're embracing each other face to face, looking each other in the heart, being compassionate, having sympathy, understanding each other more, growing respect. It's probably a ways down the road, but I believe that as Indigenous people, when we're on the road to reconciliation with more or most Canadians, we're going to have to respect the stories coming from the other experience, so that we can fully understand, and they know, and the others know that we're understanding of how racism and hatred and colonization is a process that causes harm, in this case, harm to us. And we can't rebuild, reconcile until we have those really meaningful discussions that I talked about before. Transformation comes hard if we don't talk to each other.
It's been 7 years since the publication of the findings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And at the time, you said, I think it was on an interview with the CBC, that you had mixed feelings about the report, that there was both happiness that the truth had come out, that the horror of residential schools had been recognized, but then also the realization that it really did mean you were living in a country that had, perpetrated acts of genocide, that had tried to wipe out a people. And then finally, that at least it gave you a framework to move forward towards reconciliation. And I think I think you talked about that in about 2000, sort of just after the publication. I'm wondering how you feel about it now, 7 years later.
It's little known that shortly after the publication of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there were a couple of polls conducted nationally. And the very first poll conducted said that in spite of the characterization genocide, that 7 out of 10 Canadians wanted to reconcile. 2 or 3 years later, another report came and said more than 8 out of 10, 84% of Canadians still wanted to reconcile. And so somewhere out there in our country, There's a real desire by so many people to want to reconcile. And I think that as a result of the discovery of the truth between us all, as a result of the findings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that we have never been as aware about our relationships between Indigenous people and all other Canadians. We have never even thought of it. It was just a reality that on one side there was despair and brokenness and hopelessness, and on the other side, Canadians living the Canadians' dream, driven by what they thought were to be really good values and everything good about their society, of course. But now, 7 years later, we've been educating each other, and so many more Canadians are more aware about our history together and the state of being for Indigenous people in this time. And that's a huge step, huge step. We could have continued that path of destruction and nothing would have changed. And little children born to Indigenous communities would have been still born into desperation and brokenness. But now we have all kind of Canadians and Indigenous people talking about reconciliation, asking what does reconciliation mean, and trying to determine where do we start. And that's so huge. And I think a large part of Canada has undergone that process. In addition to that, I know that various governments in various degrees have attempted to respond to reconciliation, something they have never responded to before. It was always by dictate or edict that they approached us. And now there's more discussion about what is the best way that we can support each other, support you to grow toward justice and equality and inclusion so that nobody gets left behind and our children walk hand in hand in the playgrounds where we live and work and play. We have never been this far before. Provincial government, federal governments aren't quick enough, but they're given what politics is, they're at the moment trying to toe the line between electability and the polls and between doing what's right or addition for Indigenous people. Civil society is, I've worked with multi-faith groups that represent a lot of the diversity in our community. They're really interested and they're finding ways to engage with us. Big business, small business. There are so many efforts going on. I think one of the problems we have is we don't have a platform to which we can report all of the efforts that are going on, where we can share best practices and help each other grow out this thing called reconciliation. So while people are impatient, while nothing is absolutely TV worthy of coverage, all the small acts of reconciliation are important. As a matter of fact, they're probably the glue to a sustaining sense of peaceful relationship and inclusion. So I'm glad I saw this time. I'm 83. I turned 83 the other day. Glad I saw this time. And for this time, it is what it is. And so, as long as we're committed to continuing the progress of that, I'm really happy that this is happening. Every small step, every big step, it's a journey. One brick at a time, we build it. And everybody stay the course. That's usually my advice to people. Stay the course. Be brave. Be courageous. Stand your ground. Do what you can wherever you live and work and play. Every Canadian is needed in this process.
I listened to a speech you gave back in 2016 where you talked about how this gives Canadians, the opportunity to be who we say we are, fair and just and inclusive and caring and equal and compassionate, and that participation in reconciliation, it gives us the opportunity to do that and to be that. So thank you so much for spending some time with me today, and giving me a sense that opportunity is possible, and that there is the chance for reconciliation to really continue to move forward.
Thank you. Equally, I'm so honored to be on this podcast, to have my voice heard and respected. And I think that's how we move forward together, create a mutual space of respect for each other. So thank you very much as well.
Oh, I think a great pleasure. I've been speaking with Chief Dr. Robert Joseph, author of the new book, Namwayut, A Path to Reconciliation. You can find it at kobo.com/conversation. There's a link in the show notes. Kobo in Conversation is produced by Nathan Maharaj and hosted by me, Michael Tamblin. And if it so happens that you're listening to this on Truth and Reconciliation Day, we're really glad that we could be a part of that with you.